I can tell you that owning a vineyard in northeastern Victoria is a very expensive way to practice experiential climate change adaptation. I've come to talk to you today about adaptation to climate change, concentrating more on farm. And the point I want to make through this talk is that climate change adaptation for the foreseeable future, and when the foreseeable future for us is out 2030 to 2050, is ongoing. It's not some technology package that we just implement and it's done. It's something that will be ongoing. So in that context, it's not business as usual. This is an effort from the Primary Industries Adaptation Research Network, PIARN, and particularly the people on your right, in addition to myself and Alison Kelly, our coordinator, Lauren Rickards, Richard Eckhart, Peter Grace, Peter Heyman, Beverly Henry, Mark Howden and Ross Kingwell, who have all made substantive contributions which I probably won't be able to do justice to in this presentation. But they are a terrific group to work with and a very active network. Let's first look at just very, very briefly review the challenges to climate change adaptation. You know, why are we doing it? What is all this about? This is the global land-ocean temperature index at present up to date. And all I want you to notice here is that post 1980, every decade, and we're now into our fourth, has been hotter and significantly hotter than the last decade. So clearly, the globe is warming. What has emerged from this, both in the modelling and in the actuality of observation, is that when you increase global temperatures, you not only increase the mean temperature, but you also increase the variation, and that leads to more extreme events. And as we show here, you increase the mean, and the new climate will have more hot weather, but also more record hot weather, or what we call extremes. And I think everyone in an industry here will have had an event, a sort of extreme temperature event in the last 3 or 4 years, which has been quite catastrophic. The other thing that always clouds how you deal with climate change adaptation is the question, isn't it just variability? Or is it something more than variability? And in the lexicon, because of the political wash around doing something about climate change in the mitigation space, which was the previous session, people often try to duck talking about climate change in terms of calling climate variability. I think it's very important to acknowledge that it is climate change for the following reasons. This is an analysis by Mark Howden, and if you look at, there is a very variable climate that Kim has talked about, and in that, individual years within any decade will have highs and lows. But if you look at what it was in probably your grandparents' birth times, and then you look at what it was in 2010, you can see basically that not only is it variable and perhaps a little more variable, but the baseline has shifted. The baseline has shifted to the extent that the lowest years, the coolest years in 2010 are pretty much the hottest years in 1920. And then if we project forward to the foreseeable future in 2030, where people want to make, you'll also see that the rate of warming is accelerating, which we know. But then if you look at the projected minimum years, the projected cold years are actually well outside the range in 1920, and in fact right near the top of the range in the decade leading to 2010. And of course, the maximums there are well above. So the point is, yes, there is a very variable climate, and it's probably going to become more variable, but it is overall a hotter climate no matter where you are. And if we just project forward very briefly in this again and look at global CO2 levels, this is just one part of the ice core data, which takes us back 160,000 years. It actually goes back 800,000 years. And we're showing that temperature and CO2 concentrations run together. But right at really the beginning of the last century, the 1900, we actually moved above the CO2 range that is in the time of the existence of Homo sapiens on Earth. Sure, in the history of the Earth, CO2 has been much higher and probably a little lower, but a lot higher. But if we look at the history of biology on the Earth, and particularly Homo sapiens, we're in uncharted territory. We're currently above 390, and we will hit at least 450 probably by somewhere after 2020, and certainly we were thinking we'd hit 550 by 2050, but maybe a little bit before if the most recent emissions data is to be taken into account. So that's the target. We know it's going to be hotter. I wish I could tell you what the rainfall will actually do, but there is a great deal of uncertainty around the rainfall. We know patterns like La Nina, but we don't have a connection as yet between climate change and the occurrence of things like La Nina or El Nino. So what is adaptation? It's useful just to briefly pause and think what we're talking about so we're all on the same page. The colloquial definition of this is adaptation is doing something different in your normal management operation that actually leads to an improvement in something you value. And that something you value is obviously economics, but it could be lifestyle. And Fleur might say a little bit more about that too. Of course, adaptation isn't unique to climate change. Businesses regularly adapt, they opportunistic reposition themselves to avoid risks or capture opportunities. Governments are known to change policies and programs on the basis of adapting to current or future circumstances. So climate change adaptation is really just adaptation to climate change on top of all those other things that exist in our daily lives in whatever we leave it, either in institutions or in business. But the important thing, which I want to argue today in terms of a specific climate change adaptation agenda, is these decisions are often made in the absence of complete information, and that will probably always be the case. But the important point is that we should position ourselves to provide the best information possible to people making those decisions so you can then get on Kim's risk management, because you do need information before you can reduce the uncertainty and even calculate the risk. So what climate change research, adaptation research seeks to do is to make adaptations more effective and more efficient in the face of these uncertain climatic changes. As I've said, we know very well which way we're headed temperature-wise, but there is a lot of uncertainty which way we're headed moisture-wise, and in fact the exact point of arrival in terms of temperatures and climates there is a lot of uncertainty around that as well. So effective adaptation is often limited by, if you look at a lack of just knowing what a future climate event will act, how it will affect it, what it will do for you or do against you, and what are the adaptation options you have, and furthermore, what are the uncertainties around those impacts and adaptation actions you might take. Secondly, because in many cases it's uncharted territory, not all cases, there are technological options that are not yet available. So it's very important when you're thinking of climate change adaptation to look at future climates and look at what technologies you actually might need in those technologies. And often climate change tosses up some policy barriers, as the last session was talking. The whole mitigation carbon farming initiatives is indeed a policy, not necessarily a barrier, but a policy change and something to be adapted to. And probably almost the most importantly, and Fleur is going to talk about this in much greater detail, there is a human and social dimension to climate adaptation as well. We can have all the technology we like, we can have all of Kim's decision support systems, but unless we engage at an individual or a community basis, the level of adaptation will not be large and will probably be ineffective. So the social aspects, both in the research and in the actuality of implementation, are particularly important. And the uncertainties of this change, the uniqueness of the applications, and the uncertainties of future climates means that adaptation will unfold. The adaptation agenda will unfold, it's ongoing, and the most important thing is not to think you have the answer now for 2050, to be thinking about, though, what the answer is in the future and what sort of information you might need to get that answer. And another way to think of the variability and baseline shift is courtesy of Peter Heyman. I don't know how long he spent at the beach to get this, but when you ask the question that we all see every time we go to the beach, you know, what destroyed the castle? Was it the wave, which is variability, or was it the tide as it came up, which is a shift in the baseline of the water level? So it's important to get that distinction. Both are important. You've got to live with variability, but you've also got to live with the tide. So I was asked to briefly comment on, in relation to the needs of research, what is already happening. And the whole story of farming in Australia is one of adaptation and innovation. So there's an enormous amount of adaptation happening already to climate change. I've just taken a very few examples, which I'm not going to go into any detail. But in fact, Fleur's reason, which I didn't know until I talked to there, Ross Kingwell, part of the network, has done quite a lot of work in the Geraldton area about how grain farmers in that eastern wheat belt of WA, one of the probably most severely affected areas in climate change, can adapt to climate change. And among some of the very important things is around inputs, around the fact that you need to watch very carefully about what your potential yield might be and put inputs in there to ensure you get what you should get. In other words, when you get a big year, you've got to make sure you really harvest that big year. Very briefly, Peter Heyman works in South Australia and on the Eyre Peninsula and around Kim's Miniup. The Eyre Peninsula adaptation is a lot about that shift, perhaps back to some greater livestock in a farming community, just briefly. And there's the same sort of things happening in southern New South Wales. The northern dairy industry in Victoria has changed their farming systems in response to dramatic decreases in irrigation water availability from a perennial pasture system to an annual pasture system to autumn calving rather than spring calving, all of which deliver greater water use efficiency. So it's a whole farming system change as an adaptation to climate change driven by the availability of irrigation water. And in our own work in the wine grape growers, looking at these extreme temperature events in 2009, we saw there were canopy management options and irrigation options that grape growers could employ to better manage through those events.